This week we've had many opportunities to learn about the dark reality of human trafficking through films, through speakers, and classroom conversations. Today it's my privilege to introduce a panel of experts who've been invited to help us come to terms with this reality. They are deeply committed Christians, and they have life stories that would fill up the whole time if I were to describe each one of them. We also have a group of students with us who were participants in the Thailand May term and came engaged in a direct study of the reality of sex trafficking in Thailand. They're going to be in charge. They're going to be asking the questions. These are our panel of experts, and I'm the support act and the timekeeper and the hatchet man. But before we get started, I want to introduce each of our participants. You got to know Geran in chapel on Wednesday. She worked for 7 years with the Human Rights Division of the U.S. State Department, and more recently worked with a London-based think tank called the Legatum Institute. We have Rachel Sparks, who works for the Sold Project. This is a nonprofit organization which prevents child prostitution through culturally relevant programs for vulnerable children. Imelda Bunkab is the National Constituency Director of Not for Sale, a Not for Sale campaign. This is an international nonprofit organization working to fight human trafficking and modern-day slavery. And over there on the corner is Wendy Hicks, who worked for some time in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, where she taught English in an orphan care organization and eventually found her way to Mumbai, India, and developed a real heart for youth who are drawn into the realities of trafficking. And on this side of the panel, we have 3 students who are involved in the Thailand May term. Megan Moore, who is a sophomore sociology major. Hillary McCall, who is a senior communication studies major. And Matt Blois, who is a sophomore biology major. So at this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to our informed hosts, and they're going to be asking our panel of experts a number of questions. Some of them are going to be universal questions for everybody to answer, and then they've got customized questions for each of you. So I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to be keeping it mindful of our time.
Hi, first we just want to welcome you all really quickly and thank you so much for coming. We've been talking about this issue of human trafficking all week, as most of you should be aware, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's been able to get engaged and feel involved. So we just want to encourage those of you who maybe don't feel like this is your calling or your passion to really check in today. This is something that's going on in our world right now, and it's important to educate ourselves on it. So with that, I'm going to give the mic to Hillary.
Thank you guys for all being here again. We just want to start off, we're going to be directing our questions at you individually, but if at any point you feel that another one of you would like to intervene, please feel free to do so. So this first question will be directed at Jean. Before our trip, we were told numerous times that most of the reason we were going to Southeast Asia to study human trafficking was to be learning about the issue, not to be fixing it. And it became apparent once we were there that as Westerners, we were instinctually drawn more towards wanting to be able to do something. And that was a really big struggle for us. So I'm just curious, in your perspective, where do you see us drawing the line or needing to decipher between what our role is as Westerners as far as intervention and what we need to be sensitive to when it comes to what will actually benefit those who are in need of justice?
Oh, that's an easy question to start with. Is coming. Hello? Should I try that one? Sure. Oh, there we go. Oh, okay. Sorry. All right. I'll speak a little louder. Sorry about that. I think it is a challenge. I lived in Thailand for several years myself, and actually I spent the first few years learning, and I think that's a great thing that you all went there with a learning attitude and spirit, because that's a place to start in any of the interventions on the issues. And then I think, again, a sense of humility as you learn and try to understand the issues. You will be faced with an immediate outrage and desire to fix things right away. But the challenge will be to find your best role in fixing that, which may not always be on the ground intervention. Sometimes it is, and you'll hear from other speakers who are doing some of that. But I think the key is to think about how you can best support people, especially in a cross-cultural situation, in those countries who are already fighting for those rights. And in Thailand, there are very strong laws against human trafficking. So the laws are there are tools there, but people there themselves have trouble getting the laws enforced because of different power structures. So I think the place to start is in relationship with people there who have lived the situation and what they see as the needs and how you can then best support it. And with my government hat on, I think if you come back here to the States after an experience like you've all had, think about ways that you can get our government to be doing the right thing and saying the right thing and putting pressure on the Thai government in this case to do the right thing and enforce their own laws on behalf of the victims of trafficking there. And there are lots of ways to do that through your congressmen, congresswomen, advocating, writing letters directly to the State Department, working with people who are working in government, who are also, like myself, who did that for 10 years, trying to make changes inside the government and work to give them the information they need and support them in their efforts as well.
Thanks, Jean.
Can I respond
Go for
also? Just as the average consumer and as the average American, in order to fight human trafficking here on our soil, if you're here and you're not necessarily looking to get involved to fight human trafficking, you can make choices every day that can contribute to the fight against it by being a conscious consumer, doing your research and learning what slave labor is, the clothes that we have, the products that are in our homes. There's tons of bills that we can vote on right now and be active in participating.
Thanks. This question is actually for Wendy also. When we were spending time in the red light districts of Thailand and Cambodia, we noticed a really strong American influence. It kind of affected everything from how the women danced, the music that we heard coming out of the bars and on the street. With that said, do you see a correlation in your recovery work between how we view women in the West and the self-worth of the women that you work with?
That's a tough question to answer. I think it definitely varies from country to country. In Cambodia, there's a huge influence on from American culture. For those of you that are looking to get involved in Hollywood, you see the influence all over the place. So to stand for righteousness in the film industry is huge. That's going to play a major part. In India, it looks a little bit different. Their culture is so strong, and the women just have a real pride. And so working with the survivors of human trafficking, I think it really varies from country to country.
Okay, thank you. This question is directed at Jean. So in Chapel Wednesday, you mentioned how you called on the men to be a part of this issue. And I was kind of unique in our May term because there was only 3 guys who went on the trip. And the experiences that you have as a man, I think, are a lot different than as a woman. You walk down these streets, like places, Walking Street in Pattaya, and you see these women, and you've been watching these films and hearing all these people talk about what's going on, so you know they're being oppressed, you know they're being raped every day, and you're standing right in front of them, and you want to communicate so badly how much they're worth just to be able to smile at them. But that smile or that look or anything is just communicated as a solicitation. And it becomes really hard to be a part of this issue as a man. And I'd just like you to address that more and talk about what is the role of men in this issue of human trafficking, and how can men go from being a part of the problem, driving the demand, and being the traffickers, to stepping up and being part of the solution.
Thanks, Matt. That's a great question, and it's a tough question. And thank you for being here, and thank you for going on that May term. I think that's alone right there setting a great example. I have a lot of men friends who are actively engaged in this issue, and then I have some that, especially a lot of young men who have been I've worked with and who have been really convicted in their heart about this issue, which is what I mentioned on Wednesday. And I think it's extra hard for you. It's extra difficult, and that's why it's an extra step that I think men have to take, because it's incredibly sensitive, difficult issue to discuss. But I've been really encouraged because there are men out there that are they're nauseated. They're made sick by some of the images that they see, and that is often the first reaction I hear from men as they see these things. And the next one is outrage and anger. But I think in the case of men, it almost is more paralyzing than even for women. And we all struggle with those emotions when we're working on this issue. But I think the place to start is where you are, and step back maybe a little bit from the front line of Pattaya or Patpong, and though you may be faced with that as well. But step back and say, what can I do in my cohort of male friends and my community to talk about these issues and say, the exploitation of women is just not acceptable. And there are consumer choices, there are also behavioral choices that men face every day, especially if you get out into the business world. You'll be faced with, oh, we're gonna go to a strip club for this reason, and maybe you'll be invited by your boss. These are sort of things that men are faced with and have to say, you know what, I'm going to make maybe a choice that's going to hurt my career, or a choice that's difficult, but I'm going to take a stand against that. It's places like that, I think, that is the first step to engaging and to changing sort of the cultural norms that are feeding demand for human trafficking. But I would encourage you to get together with other young men and think about ways you can engage. And it's easier to do in numbers.
I'd like to add to that as well. In terms of changing cultural norms, it's really looking at asking yourself as a male, how can I be a partner in ending exploitation or violence against women, if we're looking at it in that lens? And really challenging, if we really look back, is why are women commodified, or why are children seen as a commodity? And just really peeling back what it means to be a male in society that is sexualizes. We see commercials, the film industry. So it's really challenging that, and it can be very uncomfortable. But in that discomfort comes the result of being right.
Okay, this question is for Wendy. While we were in Thailand, I had a conversation with a staff member who expressed to me his view and experience with volunteer groups that were there in more of a short-term setting. And he talked with me about the struggles of having these groups come in and spend time with the children at their orphanage and be there for days or weeks on end, and then end up leaving them sort of with the feeling that the only reason they were there was for their own self-satisfaction and fulfillment. And that this was a really big and common occurrence there. So I was just wondering, as a founder of a nonprofit, how do you see, or where do you find the value that you would assign to these short-term missions trips and projects abroad?
Excellent question. I think it's a big issue and question to discuss within the Christian community is how do we best support the missionaries that are out in the field. And as a co-founder, initially I thought it would be wonderful to see teams going out. Unfortunately, due to the nature of working with survivors of sex trafficking, we're not able to host teams just because of the confidentiality issue and the establishment that we're trying to create with the girls that we work with. However, in my personal life and my spiritual growth, God used short-term missions tremendously. If I never went on a 2-week trip with my church, I would have never met the founder of the organization. I would have never had my eyes open to see just what God sees on a daily basis that we don't come face to face with. That led me to my year in Cambodia. It's, God will use it, and so to weigh. It's a tough issue, and one that we can definitely definitely discuss, but I think there is tremendous value on the short-term trips. And if any of you are thinking about going, I really encourage you to go if you have the opportunity.
Okay, this question is directed at Rachel. And so my question is, we've been going through this global focus week, and we've been learning about the issue of human trafficking and seeing the victims and seeing the results. But from the prevention side, could you give us kind of a profile of what an at-risk child through human trafficking looks like, and tell us how you go from being just someone who's living in a village to someone who's being trafficked?
Sure. That's a great question that I'm sure a lot of you have been thinking about as well. The research that we've done shows that the number one reason why children, and men and women as well, are trafficked is due to poverty. They're very vulnerable, and the thought of having a job, they would do anything for it, and especially to support their family. So poverty is one of the major reasons why people wind up in trafficking. In Thailand specifically, with the sex industry, many of the girls that we met in the red light districts, their stories were that, they were taken out of school at the ages of 3rd grade, 6th grade, 9th grade because the cost of education became too much for their family. And so they moved to the city to find work in order to provide for their family. And without education or job skills, there was no other option for them, really, but prostitution. And they're easily lured into the business by traffickers and pimps and those sort of people. So poverty and lack of education is definitely a huge cause. Some other risk factors that put people at risk are that they're orphaned, their parents, their mothers, or their sisters have worked in the sex industry before. And also in Thailand specifically, the Hill tribes, which are a huge minority group in Thailand, they're a people group who literally live in the hills of Thailand, and many of them are undocumented, so they have no rights. Many of them have never been to school. They don't have any health care given to them. And so that people group is specifically very, very vulnerable and at risk. And I would say, and I don't know this for sure because I guess I'm an expert in Thailand, but I'm sure that those factors, poverty, lack of education, undocumentation, are the leading causes of trafficking around our world. Thanks. This question's for Melda. We've learned this week that forced labor is a huge aspect of human trafficking, not just sex slavery, which is primarily what we studied on our trip. And while we were in Southeast Asia, it took stories of specific instances of sex trafficking to really make this problem real and tangible for us. But it seems like these stories of little girls being chained to bedposts, which is really tragic, seem to overshadow the equally harsh reality of forced labor. Are there any stories that you've encountered or experienced firsthand that have personally affected you and would help to convey the horror that forced labor is?
It's a great question. I do believe that there should be equal focus on sex and labor trafficking, and you can see also cross, if you will, victimization. So if you're looking at sex trafficking, you'll also see labor trafficking and vice versa. So it's really opening up further your eyes. An example of a labor trafficking case is right a few miles away in Los Angeles. Her name is Flor. She's a wonderful advocate speaking out against trafficking, and just recently, last week, signed a recent bill, California Bill 657, if I remember correctly, about company accountability, making them transparent regarding their supply chain. She was trafficked here into the United States through Mexico and worked in one of the sweatshops in Los Angeles Garment District. There were people that were free, if you will, but she was one of the few who was forced to stay at the factory, worked around the clock, was pretty much locked in a room, and also was forced to work on a really aggressive deadline because the other workers that got to leave weren't able to finish that. So her story, in a sense, she left children back home, and prior to leaving to come to the United States or be smuggled and then trafficked into the United States, one of her children had passed away. So as you can see, she's trying really hard to provide for her family, and found that this was the only option to do that, is to come and work at a garment factory, but did not expect this kind of level of exploitation and abuse. So I think one of the powerful things about her, and I think also we need to step back in terms of, do we really need to see or hear the horrific, brutal, physical aspects of trafficking? Not really. The fact that a person is being exploited and is denied their freedom and denied the dignity to be a human being, that's abuse. So we also have to think about that too. The psychological coercion, the psychological abuse, along with that physical abuse, is very impactful on an individual. So she was psychologically abused. Her exploiter pinched her and slapped her. So there were some physical abuse as well. And what kept her going was her faith. She kept talking to her trafficker and saying, please, if anything, let me go to church. Let me go to church. She kept badgering her trafficker, and finally, her trafficker said, okay, this one time, I'll let you go to church. And when she was able to finally leave, this was her opportunity to escape. And through her faith, she was able to believe that she can leave the situation, and found people that she calls to this day her guardian angels to help her. And really felt that that this was not what she was called to do, or this was not her purpose in life, is to be abused. Now she found a purpose in life, is to speak out. So I think that's just, and there are cases of labor exploitation. As I was driving here, I'm seeing the pumpkin patches, right? The driving through Camarillo. So labor exploitation does exist. It's right in front of our eyes. It's just we have to be able to tie it back in terms of, we as consumers, how does that fit into there are potential people along this supply chain?
Is what we were seeing. And a lot of the response that we got was, wow, this is so heavy. How are you able to deal with this? And we were only there for 5 weeks, and it felt heavy to us. And one of the verses we kind of went back to over and over again during our trip was Proverbs 31, 8-9, which essentially says, speak for those who cannot speak for themselves and defend those in need. And there's different, I don't have it written down, but it's a good one, so look it up. But the question I would ask to you is, where do you find the hope dealing with this every single day and being faced with human trafficking on a daily basis? How do you find hope in that?
That's an awesome question, and I'm sure even this week, the videos that you've seen and the speakers that you've heard, all of you are probably a little overwhelmed, and if you've gone back to your dorm room and done some more research, you probably got even more overwhelmed. This is a very dark and complex issue, and the further you get in it, the more hopeless it seems at times. And so I think it's a journey, and it's an individual journey, so I can speak to my story. My very first time in Thailand, we were actually doing the film, and we were there for 4 months and spent a majority of our time in the red light districts and speaking to organizations working to get women and children out of the sex industry. And I went home after 4 months of this process completely wrecked. I think I was a walking zombie for a good 2 weeks, and I honestly couldn't talk about my experience because I felt like talking about it didn't give it any worth because I didn't know how to describe it to anyone. But I think through that time, a lot of prayer and a lot of talking to people that were close to me, but most of all, just my prayer was that, that God would show me the hope and what am I supposed to do with this. throughout the whole journey. And for me, it came through working in prevention and the hope that we found in giving children the chance to never be exploited. For me has been my hope, and also the children that I've met and whose lives are being changed, and the people that I saw that had been rescued out of trafficking and the lives that they're now able to lead. And I think it's there's that little story about a starfish. This boy is walking along the coast, and there's like thousands of starfish, and he's throwing back in the water one at a time. And this guy comes up and is like, "Why are you throwing them back in? Look, there's like millions of starfish." And he's like, "Well, it matters to this one," and throws it back in. And so I have my starfish. Her name is Kat, and she lives in the villages of Thailand. And she's my hope every day, or the times that it gets too tough for me. So I would just say, like, continue on the journey and find out where your hope lies. If this is a issue that you're passionate about, you're going to have really dark days. But there is hope, and when you get involved and you find out where your passion lies in this issue, there's extreme hope in it.
I just want to chime in a little bit, following the talk I gave on Wednesday. I think when you start that personal engagement, whatever it is, that's the first step, and it takes a lot of courage to do that because there is darkness that you're engaging. But I can tell you from experience, once you start that, God will show you the hope, and He will show you the victories in each situation as it goes. There will be some losses too, and those you have to let go to the Lord because He's sovereign and He will care for those victims. But there is nothing like being a part of and knowing the people that are freed and then go on to live amazing lives for the Lord.
All right, we have one more question for Imelda. When we came back from our trip, we were really on fire about advocacy and raising awareness and telling everybody what we experienced and what's going on. But sometimes we would get met with this response of like, "Oh, Megan, that's great that you're so passionate and that you care about this, but it's not my passion, so it's not my problem." Do you meet that response often? And when you do, how do you respond? And what would you say to students here who maybe are feeling that way?
That is a great question, and I do face that response all the time. I'm told that, well, it doesn't affect me, so why should it matter? But it does. As was mentioned, that the clothes you wear, the food you eat, has a direct impact on somebody, not just across the seas, but here down that freeway. So it does. You do need to be involved. As we know, so I know my generation was accused of apathy. So we had to change that, and that the way of changing that was into action, and saying that, and then also again just saying it does affect you. This entire room, who built this building, the chairs. So if we frame it in that way, that's how that direct impact can kind of start, jogging somebody's mind and say, "Oh, okay, so the scarf I bought at Urban Outfitters, well, maybe, I don't know, it says it made in China, but who made that in China?" Right? So it is with you every single day. You're wearing it, you're eating it, you're sitting on it, you're living under it. And I think that's pretty powerful to say that. Because then you challenge that person to, they're just going to stand at you and say, "Oh, okay, well, that's a good point." And that is the door that opens into discussion. Well, what does that really mean as a global citizen? Because that's what we are. Our choices impact somebody somewhere in this world. So I think just opening it in that way, not confrontational or, I know I've been accused of being on a soapbox, so I've had to step down. And say, "Okay, let's talk about this. Let's really talk about this. What does it mean for you to, shop at such and such a store? What does it mean for you to own an iPhone, right? Because we know that we can trace certain conflict minerals in certain products. So it's bringing it down to that kind of level.
I was just going to ask a quick question. Are there places where people can go to find official lists of retailers and products that are implicated in trafficking?
Sorry, it's really challenging because to be a fair trade consumer, it is not easy. And who has time, right? But the more that we demand as Americans fair trade products or to hold companies responsible to not produce slave products, you have this trickle-down effect. And so it's really easy for companies like The Gap or Abercrombie or whoever to say, oh, we followed all the protocol. We're not creating anything with slave labor. But because it's outsourced, look at all those trucks coming into the factories at Cambodia with, standing body by body for hours to get to the factories. Fair working conditions, I don't think so. How much are their wages? It's not enough to get out of poverty. So then they're selling their daughters. I mean, it's just the whole cycle. It's a global issue, and we have to demand fair trade products. So where is the list? You can go online to a variety of sources. Fair trade coffee is the most available, but requested at Starbucks. They have to open a new package for you. Pete's. We have jewelry made by iSanctuary at iSanctuary.org. Other ones. There's a Live to Free organization that has a list of them.
And I believe there's a website, if I remember it correctly, it's Co-op America USA or something, if you Google that, that will list companies and actually have comments of their labor practices or if they've been found to have exploitation. They won't use the word exploitation, but have been rated. Also with Not For Sale, if I can just kind of plug some of our work, we have a Free to Work campaign where we're encouraging consumers, all of us, to look and challenge these companies and ask them, are you aware of your supply chain? Is there exploitation in your supply chain? As a knowledgeable and concerned consumer, I want to know that I'm going to Hershey's and there are no exploited children who are picking your cocoa beans to make your chocolate. And our power as consumers, I don't think we recognize our power as consumers. And we need to do that. That's our first step. And when we do that, we can definitely make an impact on companies. If we don't, then we are just, the minions of people helping to raise a profile of a company. We can raise a profile of a company, but in a good way, recognizing them as a fair trade company, as a socially responsible company that recognizes the voices of their consumers who are purchasing their products because we want them to be slave-free. I've challenged campuses to be slave-free and fair trade. Think about it. So this is one way that we can all move into action like after chapel and engage on a very basic, everyday consumerist level.
There's also on the U.S. Department of Labor's website, there is a list of sectors that are prone to child labor specifically, child slave labor, so things like the cocoa industry. So it doesn't give you companies, but it gives you areas to think about when you're buying shrimp and cocoa and that sort of thing. And that's the U.S. Department of Labor's website.
Okay, this is gonna have to be our last question, but this is to Jean. Just as we're finishing up this week after everything that has been said and all the films that have been watched, just speaking to us from your heart, what would you like to see from our generation as far as moving forward in this issue? And as large and complex as it is, what would be the biggest and most rewarding thing in your mind to see from all of us?
Thanks. I would love to see all of you think about your passion, what God is calling you to do, what He's gifted you with, your talents, your energies, your ideas, your creativity. Use it in ways that make you excited and fulfill you and that you love to do, whether that's in the film industry or the business world or the tech industry or wherever God places you. But when you go into those jobs, and I hope you love them and you're having a huge impact in those jobs and are very successful, enjoying the favor of the Lord, that you will remember that this issue is all around you, and you look for ways to use that platform, whatever it is, to make an impact on these issues. Because advocacy and the work that we all do is really important, and we need your help and support. But actually, if the world's going to change, it's going to take every one of us doing our part, whatever that is, small or large, to try to combat this problem. And I'm excited because I've seen a lot of it already. You are creative. You are an amazing generation with energy and passions that outstrip all of us. So I look forward to seeing what God will do through you.
We talked about this last night at the event that we had, but I feel like I wish I had this chapel when I was in college, because I feel like the students that I've talked to, you feel like you kind of have your hands tied because, oh, I'm a college student and I have this deadline and, you know, I can't travel abroad or I don't have time to volunteer, things like that. But the really cool part about being a student is that you're surrounded by this amazing community of people who can invest in your passions and the dreams that you have. People, professors, other students, your RDs, people that you can talk to about these newfound passions that you have a safe conversation with people who aren't going to be dream stealers and will breathe life into these passions and dreams that you've maybe have just been stirred up in you this week. So just because you're a student doesn't mean that your hands are tied. This is your time to really invest and take the time to grow in this passion that may have been created this week.
Well, thanks so much for giving us a lot to think about and a lot to act on. Thank you for your excellent questions. And we should also thank the members of Emmaus Road for putting together all of the events of this week. Would you join me in thanking our guests?